Welcome to Conversations with a Wounded Healer. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno. I'm a psychotherapist, teacher, consultant, and most importantly, a wounded healer, living and working in Chicago, Illinois.
And I'm your host, Anne Remy. I'm a counseling psychotherapist, yoga teacher, and trauma specialist living in Brighton, UK. On this show, we interview folks in a variety of healing professions, and we discuss the intersectional journey of healing self while caring for others.
But we're not just focused on individual healing, but also healing on the collective level, from white supremacy, late-stage capitalism, and the patriarchy. Thanks for joining us. Hello, Anne.
Hey, Sarah.
What's up?
It's laundry day here in Brighton.
Very important.
And I'm getting ready for Thanksgiving, which I do it on a Saturday, but I'm really excited.
Oh, you do get to celebrate out there. Do you have a Friendsgiving that you bring people around for?
I have a Friendsgiving that I cook entirely myself because my ego is like that. And also I'm a really good cook. And so we have like 30 people come to the house and I just make so much macaroni and cheese. Also other food, but like over the years I have to increasingly make more and more macaroni and cheese because my friends come with like takeaway boxes.
Yeah.
So
I feel robbed. We never had mac and cheese at my family gatherings. We would always have weird, you probably know pretzel salad. Is that a thing you guys had? Yeah, it's fucking disgusting. It's like Rich would eat it, but I was always horrified. It's like yogurt and pretzels and grapes and like, what the fuck are you doing? It's disgusting.
Hard pretzels or soft pretzels?
Hard pretzels. And there's pineapple.
If you would have said
like
soft,
it's not right.
No, that sounds like some weird like 1950s thing.
Which is also like a Midwestern weird food casserole situation.
Are we sure it's not just like Cincinnati? Because we didn't eat that in Columbus.
It might be. I'm guessing because of the pretzels, there's some sort of German connection. So I don't know. But yeah, my brother and I were talking about it recently, and it's not.
That sounds gross.
Yeah. So I would have much rather had mac and cheese than pretzel salad.
Just love it so much.
End of that story. So let's talk about this episode.
Yeah.
So I wanted to start by saying, therapists out there, I really, really love you. And I have some real concerns about our field right now. And a lot of my anger comes out in this episode. When I listened back to it, I was like, oh, I sound like a bitch. So I'm sorry if I sounded like a bitch, but I'm really concerned about our capacity to move through this really challenging time that we're in. And I know we just mentioned the election in our last intro, and, Marc and I, we recorded at the end of October, so we did not yet know who was going to be the president. But one of the really unfortunate things that's been happening on social media between therapists since Trump won is liberal therapists attacking people who voted for Trump in our field and really being shitty to one another. And there's some more specific fallout that I don't want to tell people stories for them, but like things that I've been witness to that I'm like, but we're therapists. Why are we acting like this with one another? And while I don't understand personally how somebody in our field could vote for Trump, I also want to understand it instead of just write them off and tell them they're horrible people. So the conversation that I had with Marc, I'm trying to figure out how to move through this time. I'm trying to figure out how to lead in this time. I'm trying to figure out how to not hate everyone around me through this time. And spoiler alert, Spiral Dynamics helps me do that in many ways. So yeah, that's all I have to say right now. What do you have to say?
It's funny because I remember when I listened to that part of this episode going, man, you and I just have very different. Now, granted, I'm not in all the same like social media groups you are. Like I'm in more UK groups. So it's a bit different. But even the American groups that I'm in, I didn't see any of that. Like I haven't, this is literally news to me hearing you talk about it. Because I remember when you were kind of talking about your concerns, and I was hearing you get like upset, and I was like, I don't, I don't, I don't understand where this is coming from. Like,
Mhm.
not from a, oh, Sarah's being irrational, but
Right.
just like I genuinely don't know the source of this.
Right.
And I would be curious, I guess, to speak to other therapists in the United States and just hear their experience too. And not to
Mhm.
say that you're wrong or
Oh, yeah.
that's, but it is because it's news to me. It's like, and now I live in the UK and you don't talk about politics. So
Mhm. So they don't even do it on social media?
yeah, I mean, there will be kind of like loose things, but yeah, it's not a thing. And you can actually get like kicked out of groups for that. So, and I guess to kind of hear you say that makes me sad. But I think what I also hear is that therapists are still just humans and no one's doing a good job right now.
Yeah.
Like, not a good job. No one is doing well
No one
right
is
now.
humaning well right now.
No one's
Exactly.
humaning well right now. Because
Exactly.
no matter where you're at on this, like, I don't know, very few people won, even if you did vote for Donald Trump.
Right.
Very few people actually won. So, yeah, I think there's a collective mourning going on,
Some people are being
and
angry and
yeah,
pointing fingers. Yeah, I'll
yeah.
send you an article, Anne, and I'm not gonna link it in the show notes because I don't wanna link to a right-wing, like, conspiracy article, but what was interesting about so basically, the day after the election, on a couple there's, like, 3 different Facebook groups, I think, that were, like screenshots were shared of really nasty things that clearly liberal therapists are saying about either Trump voters or therapists who voted for Trump. And, in this right-wing article, they have these screenshots and it's all basically like, look how unethical therapists are, all this sort of stuff. And truthfully, like, I actually don't disagree. I do think a lot of what people were writing on there, I don't know that I would say unethical, but I would say, like, this is not how we should be treating one another or other people that we disagree with. And then what happened after that article got leaked, one of the people who, his comment was put on the article, posted on that same Facebook group and said, "Whoever you are, we're going to come get you. We're going to find you and you're going to pay."
Oh dear.
Yeah. So, yeah. And, I've talked before on the podcast about what's been happening in the Chicago therapist Facebook groups post Gaza, like, I mean, there's really no post, but since October 7th of last year. And it makes me really concerned. Like, yes, therapists are human, but if we are like, there's that meme, like, look for the helpers, and the helpers are like, passed out and not doing well. That's what it feels like right now. And that's what scares me is if the therapists aren't okay, how are we helping our clients be okay? So I'm sorry to be, I don't know, man. I don't know. I was going to say, I don't think I'm doom and gloom about it, but I might be right now. And maybe that's my version of not being okay.
I Yeah, I'm not feeling that same thing at all. And now, again, I'm not in those groups and I'm not seeing it happen. So that might be it. I don't know. I don't know. The only thing that keeps coming up for me is that everyone's going to grow, which is reductionist. And that doesn't mean there's not going to be pain. But I think our profession is going to grow. And I don't feel like I'm resisting the doom and gloom. I feel like it's just not there for me
No,
right
no, no.
now.
I totally appreciate that. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I think that this is a tipping point for an evolutionary moment for the field, because other things that have been coming up are how we work with difference in the therapy room when, originally therapists were taught to be a blank slate. It feels like our culture is increasingly requiring more authenticity, which means that there's going to be more difference and there's going to be more conflict. So we're going to have to, like, work with nuance, I think, in a different way. And I don't know what that's going to look like. And so I mean, I guess what I wanted to say before introducing Marc, and I know we didn't talk about Marc at all. And so Marc and I met. I was doing a training called Value Match, and they basically have an assessment where you can sort of see the distribution of where your values are, and also how it impacts your organization. Looking at like everybody's distribution of values and how that kind of comes to be. And Marc was speaking, and I felt really resonant with him. And so I was like, oh, will you be a mentor for me? And he was like, no, that feels weird. Do you want to work together? So we conceptualized this upcoming training that we're going to host, a spiral dynamic certificate program called Redefining Psychotherapy. Because I want to have conversations with people who are also seeing this precipice of change and like co-creating ways that we want to be with this time, instead of just like being in our homes yelling at people on social media. So that's why I wanted to talk to Marc about all this stuff. But yeah.
I mean, it's a good jumping off point for what comes next, I think.
Yeah, that's the hope. So let me introduce you to Marc Mathys. Marc is an accomplished specialist in organizational transformation, certified professional coach, and social entrepreneur who holds multiple degrees, including engineering and an MBA in responsible management and leadership. As co-founder of Paradigm 21, he guides organizations towards agile, distributed models while serving as a sought-after consultant and trainer in spiral dynamics and system change. One other thing I wanted to say before I start the episode is the other thing I've been recognizing, and I've talked to listeners about this before, the podcast is definitely an expression. It's kind of like my live journal, and I see my own development and things, right? And things that are of interest to me, the things that I'm seeing and that I want to talk to other people about. And I've recognized how interested I am in system change right now. And so, I'm thinking about his episode and some other episodes that will be coming up that are less about the individual and more about the collective. And while that wasn't necessarily intentional, I'm recognizing that pattern and sort of calling attention to it now, that I'm not always asking the question about being a healer, because it's not always about that one person, but it's about sort of the system that we're trying to tap into and resource from and evolve through. And that's what the conversation with Marc was all about for me. Anything else, Anne, before we take it away?
No, ma'am.
All right. Please enjoy my conversation then with Marc Mathys. Are you feeling the seismic shifts currently reshaping the therapy field? From AI to rising healthcare costs, our field is at a crossroads. But what if these disruptions weren't just challenges, but opportunities for transformation? I'm excited to introduce Redefining the Future of Psychotherapy, a groundbreaking 12-week program where I've partnered with organizational consultant Marc Mathys to help therapists navigate and thrive in these challenging times. Together, we'll explore how cultural values and systemic forces are impacting mental health care. You'll learn to apply powerful frameworks like spiral dynamics to enhance your practice, transform challenges into opportunities, and develop practical strategies for both you and your clients. Starting February 13th, 2025, we'll meet virtually every Thursday for live interactive sessions. You'll earn a Level 1 certification in spiral dynamics, and up to 24 CEUs are available. This isn't just about surviving these tumultuous times. It's about working together to create positive change. Register now at tinyurl.com/futureoftherapy and join us in redefining the future of psychotherapy. That's tinyurl.com/futureoftherapy. Hello, Marc. Welcome to Conversations with a Wounded Healer.
Hello, Sarah.
How are you doing? It's evening for you. It's middle of the day for me.
I'm doing great. A bit nervous to show up on this super famous podcast with hundreds of episodes.
So famous. Well, thank you. And as I told you before, there's no expectation of you solving all the world's problems, being the expert in everything. I'm pretty good at picking guests, so I have a feeling this is going to work out okay.
All right, I'm just going to work on trust with you.
Okay,
then.
yeah. Well, do you want to introduce yourself and tell folks what you're doing in the world?
Sure. So let's try this. I have an engineering background. I grew up in Switzerland. Then I embarked on a career, like trying to be really successful and good at what I was doing. And I was quite successful at that. I grew up in Switzerland, and at some point I moved to the US. So I suppose you have mainly a US audience. So for that, it's worth noting I've spent 2 years on the West Coast and 2 years on the East Coast. So I have tried a bit of the taste of both of the sides of the parenthesis of America. And I've traveled extensively in between, but I have not lived in between.
Mm-hmm.
And then I moved back to Switzerland at some point after having lived in the US, and continued this career growing thing up until a stage where it felt like there was nothing more to grab. There wasn't another job, another title, another something. And it started to not really make much sense anymore. And what also happened is, just around that time in my life, is I have 2 children, a daughter and a son. And my son, when he was 7.5, was diagnosed with cancer, actually. And he's, before I go along with the story, he's fine.
Mm-hmm.
He's a very grown 17-year-old boy today in perfect health and all of that. So yeah, very fortunate and a lot of gratitude for that. Yet it's the kind of life event that really made me question the purpose of life itself, and who am I as a man, who am I as a human, who am I as a father, who am I in, my professional career? Who am I? What's the point of all of this? And in a way, I would even say it's, with the news of a cancer coming to a child, your child, my child, came the question of mortality, and it inevitably kind of put the mirror towards my own mortality, my own purpose. Like, what do I want to leave behind? What's the sense of that? And that was a turning point and it didn't take very long until life started to manifest itself differently for me, or I generated very unconsciously, interestingly enough. I would love to say, oh, I had this big realization and I came to the conclusion that I needed to do this. No, it wasn't like that at all. I was actually not super conscious, super aware of myself. I had done some personal development here and there. I had peeled the first few layers of the onion just enough so I could do something meaningful, but I didn't have the capacity to anticipate things like that and see through it. So I started acting in a way that it threw me and put me in a situation where I eventually lost my job, which after the fact is really interesting to reconstruct the trail that I followed and to actually see, like, oh my God, if I had wanted to do that, I couldn't have done it better. Like, it's so on purpose. I had no idea I was doing that. Anyway, so that really put me in that situation where I now had to make a choice. Do I continue? Could I activate my network and try to go get another job like this where I can make a lot of money and be successful and feel very important? And that's the time in which I realized I was kind of, the metaphor I would put around this is how the energy I was using in my work really starting to look more and more like filling a hole in the sand with water and running very fast to the water to fill the bucket, coming back to my hole, filling it, and realizing how quickly it got empty, and etc. And somehow the hole got bigger and the bucket needed to upgrade, and then I need to learn to run faster, and just an endless story of slightly changing circumstances around it, but still kind of pointless. And that's one version of the story. And so I'm going to branch it a little bit and say, actually, I can also see today that this really served the purpose.
Yeah.
As meaningless as it was, it served the purpose. I had to prove to myself a number of things. I had to overcome some of the early conclusions I made about myself in moments of childhood, being bullied, not being popular, feeling ugly, having difficulty finding myself in relationships and stuff like that. from those conclusions, I felt like I had to learn to be better than everyone, and I had to show that to the world. And maybe then I would be, worthy of love, respect, and attention, and God knows what else, was needed to be filled in that bucket. So, as pointless as it might have seemed or looked, it actually served the real purpose of actually coming to the end of that and sort of realizing, oh, what if I stopped? What if I didn't do that anymore? What else would I do instead? And what if I left that hole in the sand where it was and started building something next to it instead of trying to fill that? So that is probably the biggest turning point, or one of the biggest turning points in my life, at least when it comes to, I acted it out in the professional domain there by finding initiatives, something to launch, something to start that had values in it. But just to take a little piss at it, I didn't even know what the word value meant. Like, other than, money is valuable. Like, things are value, right? Like, value, but a value? Like, what's a value? I didn't even have the words. The landscape wasn't really open enough to even have values in the spectrum. And so I had to discover what values were. That's a bit of a late bloomer to do that in around 40.
I don't know that that's late, actually. I don't know.
So that's a bit my story of how I ended up doing something that, I can attach some meaning and purpose today, and say that my professional landscape today is only composed of purpose-driven initiatives. And the main thing that I ended up doing after having taken coaching training, becoming a certified coach, and doing all sorts of personal development and learning more about entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship and how to combine all of these. In my coaching, I discovered some frameworks and methods that allowed to kind of work with teams, with people. And I thought, I want to work with teams. I like working with groups of people. I wasn't so, I learned to do all the coaching of the person one-to-one, but something drew me to the groups, to the people. I didn't know what. And I learned about the framework. We might talk a bit about it later, called spiral dynamics. I also learned about the integral worldview, lots of little different tools and frameworks that talk about system change. And having just kind of come out of a transformation myself, I felt, I think I have some credibility talking about transformation after what I'd just been through. And in that process, I had to completely question my relationship to money, power, success, and attach some of these in a complete different new meaning for myself, to be able to throw myself completely into the unknown. That being said, I did have savings, so the unknown didn't mean that I put myself at risk of starving, but I did put myself at risk of running or living a life that looks so different from the image of success that I had before. I had to choose to cut my income pretty much by 3 or 4 and to start living with very little in the transition phase, which ended up lasting several years of reinventing and trying things and seeing what works and what doesn't. And on the other end of that tunnel, my current activity is working with organizations, working with teams, working with groups of professionals to whatever extent there is a need for them to transform how they function, how they organize, how they collaborate, how they communicate, how they structure themselves. How does it all work? And what are we all serving, and why would it somehow have to be aligned with maybe their purpose? Maybe there's something in what kind of culture we develop and what kind of structure we create around a team, and the purpose that we have and the kind of people that we want and the values that we have, that there's a need for coherence there. And maybe there's also a need for coherence in the world that we live in today, where we are all looking to contribute to things, to elevate the game a bit. So those are the kind of transformations that I love to work with, where it's not just about being more performant or more this or better that. This is just enhancement of a current system, of a current worldview. So the kind of transformation that I work with teams is basically organization that work in a classical structure with some form of hierarchy. It doesn't necessarily have to be the typical 5-layer hierarchy and all of that. Sometimes the hierarchy is very relaxed, but nonetheless, it's a hierarchy. Everyone knows who the managers are. Everyone knows who the general managers are, or the directors, or the C-suite people. Who are these people? Everyone, they have the maybe multi-layered, maybe 1 layer, maybe 3 layer of hierarchy. And they're like, yeah, but it turns out like, and you often the request comes from the leaders, and they say oftentimes we are pulled into all the important decisions. We have to carry all the responsibility. Everyone's asking for freedom. Everyone wants independence. They want to work from home. They want this, they want that. But in the end of the day, all the responsibility is on us, and all the decision making is on us. And every time there's a conflict, it comes to us, and we're the bottleneck. And they're carrying the mental load of everything.
I know nothing about that.
And so they're like, is there something else that's possible? How could we? I mean, people are asking for freedom and autonomy, but we don't feel like we trust them necessarily, that we can give it to them. But we would like them to take the responsibility, but then they want the freedom, not the responsibility. And we were willing to give them the responsibility, not necessarily the freedom. Takes a little bit of admitting that. Like, is there a way to make that work somehow? Is there a way of changing the way teams work, the way individuals are empowered? Is there a way to reinvent what it means to work as a team, as an organizations even, and maybe to even question, is there still a need for the classic management, which is more than a century old and inherited from Taylor and Ford, we're talking 1910, 1911, division of labor.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the model of society today is inherited from that paradigm, from that value system, from that space where we thought we had to control, organize, specialize the work, and control and manage, and then improve yield and quality and all of that. And when it doesn't work, you reshuffle the whole thing and try a different way without rethinking the system itself.
Right.
The kind of transformation that I do is with the people who are like, we know there's got to be something else. We have no idea what it is.
Yep.
But we want to get there, and we don't know how to get there. Can you work with us? Can you do that?
Yep. So many things. First thing I want to bring in, hearing you talk about you changing your relationship with success, with how you thought of yourself, sort of being able to like redefine who you are and how you see the world. It made me think of why therapists become therapists. And there's a study that was done, and I think it was 2019. I don't know. I've got the research somewhere, people. But it was essentially saying like all of the reasons we go into the field are all based on our own childhood stuff, right? And my curiosity for people who are listening to this is, I think that our relationship with care and what it means to be a caretaker in our field is something that needs a real update, because I'm seeing, and I'm sure if you're listening, you probably already agree with this, and that's why you're here, but I'm seeing a lot of people pressure themselves, which then gets in the way of doing really good therapy work. I'm seeing people be asleep to their own neuroses and whatnot that they might be bringing into the therapy room, into the work. And then on an organizational level, this is all coming into our businesses, right? And the therapy field is unique in that many people just work by themselves. So we're not an organized body in that way, but I swear to God, when we all come together, we can be so fucking disorganized. It is a challenge, right? It can be a challenge to decide how we move the field forward, to figure out how we do organizations differently, whether it's group practices or community mental health or whatever. And we don't even know how a business, quote unquote, should be run because we were never taught that anyway. So it just feels like a lot of people having challenges relating to themselves in a way that can support the work and relating to the systems that we work in to support the work.
Sarah, there's something, I'm going to actually not answer it directly. I'm going to try a little bit of a tangent here,
Okay.
if you let me. If you
Absolutely.
don't, that's okay. I'll obey. I'll come
Absolutely.
back in line. What if? Most interesting question always start with what if, right? I mean, I just want to talk about the therapist situation, right? You
Yeah.
say, oh, we usually work on our own, and we might have gotten into this because of a degree of care. Okay, well, that's, some positive sort of like desire to contribute in some way.
Right.
And I want to ask, what else? Like, we don't end up necessarily in a profession, in a career, just because of that wanting to care.
Oh, yeah, no.
There are a few more things along the road.
Yep.
And one of them that I'm interested in is, what did I choose not to do instead? So what did I actually choose not to develop? What are the skills I chose not to learn? What are the works I chose not to have? Which basically, another way of asking the question is, what did I reject?
Yeah.
And then, as a result of everything I rejected, I found that therapy was such a good thing after all. Plus, I have this original core value that has me wanting to care for people and work with people. But there's also a number of things I probably rejected. And so
I see where you're going, and I like it.
So one could wonder, if you bring a bunch of people who, I'm with maybe here, right? Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm just exploring, huh?
Yeah.
You bring a bunch of people who maybe rejected the same thing
Yeah.
and chose the same vocation for good reasons. Both of them, by the way, are good reasons. What you choose because of your values and what you choose because of what you reject, they're all good reasons. But for good reasons, you chose a certain career path, a certain work. And then you bring a bunch of these together. Well, guess what? That profile of that group is going to create a very strange dynamic. And that dynamic is going to be what happens. I mean, it's not that different if you put 100 engineers in a room and nobody else and let them sort of self-organize. I mean, I'm using engineer because it's about the other end of the spectrum, right?
Exactly. Correct.
And it's the same, right? It's
Right.
like people who went into a specific career path for specific reasons and find themselves in communities of people who think the same and rejected the same things. And that would be no different for therapists. And then, so if I kept going a bit with my guessing game,
Do it.
I would guess that there's a certain rejection of structure, of hierarchies, of formal structures of organizations that are run in a certain way that don't provide a certain freedom that I want, that don't allow for me to express myself in the way that I want, and that don't carry the values that I have.
Yep.
So therefore, I will reject everything. I mean, if I force it, if we just exaggerate it a little bit, if we just kind of like make it a bit more. So I would then reject everything that's an organizational, formal structure with procedures and rules that tell me I have to do this and I have to do that. And this I can't do, and I have to show up at this time and this hour. And I would hate every part of that. And then most likely I would also kind of have a bad opinion about the business world, capitalism. That's such an evil thing then, right? Because that's like how those beasts of structure grew into these examples today that create all this social injustice and inequalities. So therefore, that's not people value centered. So therefore, that must all be bad and evil. And therefore, business is bad. So you start rejecting all the structure part and you start rejecting all the business and entrepreneurship part of it. What are you left with?
We also forgot the rejection of power.
Oh, yeah, true. I should have gone to that one too.
Yeah, because we come from, oftentimes we have experienced our own trauma that was at the hand of someone having power over us and misusing that power. And so we reject power altogether.
Right. So that's three different paradigms, so to speak, or value systems in spiral dynamics. Doesn't matter. Those are three different sort of worldview or sort of part of the stages of evolution. Those are already three of them that get rejected. And in my experience, when you then try to build on sort of more complex value system over that, if you have no healthy integration of the earlier ones, if you haven't come to terms with, let's say, these three, right? The structure and organization and the business world and the definition of success as it's accepted today in our society and the power, well, guess what? You will find all of those coming back as shadows to hunt you back in the new thing that you're trying to create. So oftentimes we then find ourselves in groups of people with beautiful values, amazing intentions, wanting to create, communities, groups, organizations, structure that are people-driven, value-centered, purpose-based. And we're like, oh, sure. I mean, come on. That's got to be the answer to it all, right?
Guess what, guys?
Maybe yes and no.
Yeah.
Because the and no comes from, if you haven't integrated the previous layers, it's almost like if you think of a building, right? If you think of foundation levels, if you haven't integrated certain foundation levels, those will kind of challenge you or come back as shadows later on.
Can I bring up a really specific one?
Yeah.
That I think people will relate to? I think boundaries come into play with power, right? If we don't have boundaries, we don't know what our yes and our no is, right? And this also kind of goes along with our rejection of capitalism. So if I'm a therapist, I am taught that I am supposed to help people, and that is the number one thing that I do. And in order to do that, I have to help as many people as I can. And things that I see happen a lot, especially with new therapists that have been my staff members, is when we're running the business and then a client continues to cancel the sessions, but the therapist doesn't hold the client accountable, right? There's no boundaries, right? Which is the yes and the no. There's also no accountability for them in terms of a financial penalty for, wasting the therapist's time. That feels to me like it lives all in this, I just want to help people space. And it feels like a rejection of two of those earlier paradigms that are really crucial to being able to support yourself as a therapist and maintain the ability to care for your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would go even further, is that if you're not finding, let's take that example of a therapist, if as a therapist, you're not finding access to a healthy expression of your own power, and that might be as simple as finding a healthy way of expressing yourself in an assertive way. That might be already the beginning of it.
Yeah.
And setting boundaries. If you don't do that, if you're rejecting that, how are you ever going to be able to work with the people, your clients, that you're working with? Now imagine, let's just shift the lens for a moment, right? We have a therapist who's not capable of holding the client accountable because it's kind of not cool to be in your power, and it's socially sort of rejected now. No one should use that. We look down socially on all of this expression of power because why? Because there's so many unhealthy expressions of power. We've thrown the baby out with the bathwater.
Right. So
every expression of power is bad and to be avoided at all costs. Well, that's the current paradigm. If we're rejecting three in the current one, it's kind of a cool thing now. It's like, no, ego is bad, power is bad, like everything.
Right.
We can't express it healthily. Now, shift the lens. Imagine you have your therapist and your client is a person who's in a relationship that is toxic and unhealthy. Okay?
Yep.
That person finds themselves in a relationship where, I don't know, the other person is totally taking advantage of them, stepping over them. They're lost. They're feeling like they want to die. They can't even imagine how to get out of it. They're stuck. They're completely stuck. The only thing that's eventually going to get them out of it, guess what that is? That same thing, that same access to a certain assertivity to be able to say, stop, no, enough, go away.
Yeah.
I'm out. So how are you as a therapist going to hold the space for your client to step into their power, which is the only way that they can eventually start moving things if you yourself are not capable of holding yourself in those same in the same conversation with maybe not that same client, maybe it's a different one, but it doesn't matter. As a matter of integrity, something's completely out. So therefore, the shadow of what you're rejecting is biting you in the areas where you need it, because you can't really do that, because you don't want to encourage people to get in their power if you yourself can't do it.
Right.
Then you bring their therapists in a group, and you want them to have a session and where they're going to exchange a number of things. So no one's going to step into their power because that's like a big taboo. You can't do that.
Right.
So we can't get into power. We can't create a structure and a hierarchy of who should be talking at what time and have a schedule, because that was also something we rejected earlier, right?
Right.
And so therefore, we're going to do this collectively, right? In the group, in the harmony with the values. And so everyone's going to have the time to talk, and we're going to talk about things and endlessly. And what I'm noticing in these spaces professionally, when people are rejecting those specific values, is that the power that they have not sort of stepped into embodiment in the places where it would be healthy to do comes out and expresses itself in the places where it's absolutely inappropriate and unhealthy to do so, namely in those collective spaces.
Yep.
So what I observe is, under this thick layer of let's pretend that we're a community, that we're doing things together with our values, underneath that, you have a lot of inauthenticity, you have a lot of power games, you have a little talking over, disagreeing, yeah, but, no, but I, but this, but that, but and if you take the magnifying glass and you put that under the magnifying glass, you see all the power games are played in there,
right,
where they shouldn't actually be. They have no place there. There would be an actual place for harmony, but we can only do it if everyone has stepped into their power and has the capacity to say no.
Right.
Or let's end this conversation, let's move on to the next topic. Enough is enough on this one. I think we've covered it. And it's an intervention that's like taking space in a group.
Exactly. I was literally dealing with this with a client of mine, and I'm not going to go into the details because I don't want to reveal all the stuff that we're working on, but that what you just described is exactly it, right? Like a group of people trying not to have power, trying not to organize anything, really rejecting all of this stuff. And then at the end of the day, there's all this misplaced ego and or what are we even doing here sorts of questions that negate the whole purpose of this group in the first place. And I mean, you nailed it. And I think what do I wish? I so deeply want to be surrounded by people that are seeing the things that I'm seeing, not necessarily in order to validate me, because I finally gotten to a place in my own work with my own power that I can validate myself. But I guess I'm seeing all of the crisis points that we're in as a field. And from where I stand right now, it feels like people don't want to hear it. They're either afraid of it and say that what I'm saying is dangerous or scary, or they're just like, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you're seeing. And it makes me sad to feel so disconnected from, I mean, I went through a period with my therapist where I was like, I don't know if I want to call myself a therapist right now because I don't feel like I belong with these people. And that makes me sad. Like I'm on the precipice of tears right now. That makes me want to cry because that's how I've identified myself. But I can't identify with a field that is responsible for fracturing itself right now based on people deciding what's right and wrong. And I'm talking about Gaza right now. Like the genocide and what's happening over there has fractured our field. And it breaks my heart because what we're really talking about is people in pain. And we miss talking about the fact that everybody's in pain because we're busy talking about whose pain is more important.
Yeah.
And everybody's pain is important. And everybody's pain is not as urgently important, but everybody's pain is important. And in order to get to have everybody feel like we can act towards the same end, we have to have the same definition of what's going on. And we are so far from that. We can't even have conversations. It's breaking my heart.
Yeah, a lot of that is happening, and it's happening in your field of therapists. But if you look at what happened during the pandemic with the whole, whether you were supposed to be
right,
free and do whatever you want, whether you're supposed to trust only in science and vaccination would solve everything, or
Right.
whether government policy would put rules in place to tell us what we're allowed to do and not to do, or whether it was the executive power taking control and saying, stop, we got to put the halt to this, we got to make executive decisions, which is a way of stepping into power. We've just now mentioned 4 of the different value systems, paradigms.
Right.
They're actually the same that we kind of just talked about.
Right.
Those all coexist in our world. There's actually more than that, but there's a number of paradigms that sort of coexist, and they're like different stages, if you want, of evolution, where we as a society go through, where our organizations, the way people work together, go through, and we as individuals also go through as we sort of navigate more complex life conditions.
Right.
And look at a global perspective. The global perspective that we're facing now is getting more and more complex by the day. Whether you look at the armed conflicts and wars that are happening in the Middle East and Ukraine, whether you look at global warming, whether you look at how we handle a pandemic, which is a global issue. And what a lot of these have in common is that they can't be solved by one single worldview, by one single mindset.
And can we pause on that for 1 second? Because
Sure.
This is where I keep saying this to folks, the space between what we want, right? Because if we think we have the right answer and we want this thing, but we can't have it because there's this disparate way that we're seeing it, the space between where we are and what we want is grief or anger. And we're not feeling the feeling about the thing. We're so busy pointing at everybody else and saying, you're the reason that we can't get to this thing that we want. But really, we just need to grieve this is where we are.
Yeah, but underneath that is I'm right, you're wrong.
Right, exactly. Right.
So I'm right means the lens through which I look at the world is the correct one.
Right.
And therefore yours, which is, if it's not the same as mine, must be therefore wrong.
Right.
So there's 2 things to distinguish here. There's the fact that there are multiple lenses to begin with. And I think if you look a bit of American politics, how divisive it is, and we get to record this a week before.
Right.
Something interesting is going to happen in November. I heard this on a Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
There are multiple, and not just 2, by the way. Just because you have a political system that only has 2 parties doesn't mean there are only 2 worldviews, right? But when different worldviews oppose each other and keep doing so for long enough, you end up with division and fraction that at some point can feel beyond capacity to repair.
Correct.
So when I talked before, like that's already 3 or 4 of the different paradigms or value systems. So I'm using those words interchangeably when I mean worldviews.
Mm-hmm.
This is the same thing, right? So there are multiple worldviews that coexist today, and every single one of them, so far, in the dominant ones, believes that if everyone were to just do and think like I say, it would solve the problem.
And I've never said that before on this podcast. Oh my God, don't call me out.
So
Go on.
Let's demonstrate that. Let's play with that a little bit, because that's a really interesting topic, I think. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I would like to roll into those a little bit in a second. But before that, realize that at the core of that is sort of a programming and a belief that there is something called right and wrong, and that my worldview is right and yours is wrong. And even if I later shift my worldview, I will say, well, now that this one is right, the previous one was wrong, right? It's not like I was right too. We come with this pre-wiring of right and wrong. This is actually built in one of the value system, is one of the paradigms. That is the one that is centered around the kind of education that we get. That is, when we were talking about rejections before, that is the one that brings the system and the rules in place. And that exists as well in, whatever, the government, the way society is organized, the way organizations organize themselves, the rules, I mean, traffic rules, like the laws, everything. And it expresses itself also in the religious view of the world, where there is this creator and the creations, and this is non-denominational religious view. All monotheist religion pretty much share that.
Right.
And the idea is that, okay, well, there's this external creator who obviously had some sort of a grand purpose or will that I now have to find a way to serve and to execute. And, I've been given a book and some rules, if I'm lucky, to navigate this world. And if I do it well, great, and then get rewarded. And if I don't do it right, well, I'll get punished. So this notion of good and bad, right and wrong, is as an external sort of truth, an external knowledge that is deeply rooted into how the society we grew up in, the Western world. I want to underline that might not be the case in other parts of the world, but in the Western world, most of us kind of grew up in a system that the minute we went to school, we entered a system, we entered a structure. There were external authorities that if it isn't a god or a priest, it's a teacher or a principal. But there's these external authorities and there's a certain hierarchy in there. And someone's saying what's right and what's not, and I have to abide by that. And so we integrate to all of us that notion of right and wrong to such a deep level that we run it unconsciously everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the right and wrong that we carry. And that's the lens through which, like, we're going to express every one of these value systems. But now let's take something interesting like a pandemic, right? How do you solve it, right? So one of the power taking control value system would be executive governments taking executive measures, taking executive decisions very quickly to act in emergency and saying, okay, if we cut this, if we do that, if we ban this, if we do that, it doesn't matter if it's legal or not, we'll figure that out later. There's an emergency, we have to act, then we can solve it, right? Well, guess what? That didn't solve it, okay? Then there is, okay, well, we have to put rules in place and regulations, and we have to force people that you can't go there, you can go there, social distancing. Then you have to do how many people can be in how many square feet or meters or whatever, all sorts of rules, and who can go out, who cannot go out, all of that stuff. And so we put rules in place, we control like how this thing can spread and not spread, and who can cross a border and not cross a border, board a plane, not board a plane. We put tests in place and how many days you have to be in quarantine and all of that. Is that going to solve it?
It didn't.
It didn't. Okay, so next one. Well, great news. We have these pharma companies who can create vaccines and have all this research and all these scientists. And if, all we got to do is let the pharma solve the problem. They can just produce a vaccine almost overnight. I mean, actually it was kind of overnight if you think about it, in terms of how long these things usually take. I mean, miracles were done, beautiful research. I mean, amazing work. All the scientists of the world kind of put their head together trying to solve this, and not the world, but at least of the pharmas, trying to find solutions to that. And, they did stuff with that, just like the previous things were also done. Did the vaccine solve the pandemic?
It helped, but didn't solve it.
No, exactly. And the other worldview were the people who were now we're sort of approaching to the landscape we're talking about. Those who reject the power, those who reject the structure, and those who reject the business and capitalism and all of that. So obviously these ones are going to be against all the three others. So what's their worldview? Well, it's going to be, get everyone to be free and do whatever they want. We should be able to choose what we do with our lives, with our body, and no government entity or no business should tell us what to do. And no one's going to tell me I should get vaccinated, and it's all bullshit anyways. And science isn't wrong anyways, and blah, 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 and throw everything out and basically claim personal freedom and personal responsibility. And if everyone was left to their own devices, would that solve a pandemic?
Definitely not.
Probably not. So here we're a bit in a pickle, right?
Well, and then there's the other one, which has been happening in the US, is that if you are going out and you're not masking, still now that means that you don't care about people, and especially you don't care about people with disabilities. So that's the other option, is that we all need to remain masked all of the time in order to make sure that nobody gets sick.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, yet other extra layers. That's a particularly US notion, where some sort of morality made its way into you should, otherwise you don't care, and you don't care, you can't afford that, and it doesn't matter if it makes no real sense. we rejected science a long time ago in that kind of worldview that,
Right.
any sort of real world-based evidence that says it actually isn't have that big of an impact or something, that piece of information, of fact, isn't going to really shift, because the culture is you have to conform to a group that has put value in caring for other people at the center and taking that at the cost of everything
Right.
else. Yeah. So where I wanted to get to is that, like, if all of these worldviews are not going to be able to solve global problems, and that's just the example of the pandemic, but take a war, take global warming, those are all issues that can't be solved by executive power. They can't be solved by governments because they go beyond borders and stuff like that. They can't be solved from business, and they can't be solved by the people, by the citizen, by us alone. So if you look at these four and say, well, none of them can actually solve any of these, how the fuck are we going to get organized or do something that's going to be contributing, to solving the whole difficulty and suffering that there is, and not even the risk that we're looking at, the risk that we're facing in the future with global warming as a species, as a planet? How are we gonna solve that? And as long as everyone's trying to argue that their worldview is better than everybody else's and everybody listen to them, no, I know better, listen to me, you're bullshit, you make no point, blah, blah, blah. I mean, you divide families, you divide communities, you divide people. It's all dividing people. And there is no super conspiracy that's trying to divide us. We're pretty clever to do this on our own, with this belief system that I'm right and the others are wrong, and therefore we're going to fight amongst each other and not look together for a solution. And here's sort of the big, how do we get out of that? How do we stop looking at everything as having to be polarized? How about we get out of creating more division, more polarity by judging and rejecting everything that we don't like?
Right.
Well, the solution is to actually integrate and not reject.
Yep.
How do we find a way to integrate healthy aspects of power? And notice I said it very softly.
Yes.
Soft power as well, not power over,
Power
but
with.
actual power. Not even have to be with. With is another, not to over. That's another dichotomy we're creating there, right?
Sure.
There's a healthy way of power. It could be just power. I'm powerful. I stand by myself. I know where my boundaries are. That's just power. Or in a case of emergency, I make a decision and I just tell other people what to do. That's a very healthy thing to do. So if no one does that, usually nothing moves.
Right.
And emergencies get worse.
Right.
We're going to have to find a way. How do we integrate healthy doses of structures and rules that we abide by, but not just to create a system for the purpose of itself, but how do we organize and structure ourselves in a meaningful way that helps us get towards what we want? And so it's not a question of more government, no government. It's not a left-right political question neither. It's like finding the fine line of what's enough for everyone. How do we include everyone's needs in it, and having what's needed and not extra? And so, if you look at politically, both sides are right, but still fighting about it. Are there a domain where there's probably too much government? Yes. And is there a domain where there's probably too little has been cut? Yes. Okay. So can we all agree that we put more where it's needed and less where it's needed? I mean, if we think we're both right and it's an and it's complementary, you can start creating structures that make sense, that allow to be, and that are not fixed, that are reevaluated and evolving and disappearing if they're not needed anymore and reemerging if they are needed again. And how do we include, the world of business? How do we include the fact that we have an economy going on, and that everything that gets done and created and traded and exchanged in this world gets done through a system that is transactional, and transactional implies an exchange of money and values. And capitalism, to a degree, is based on a system that creates a market or a platform where this can happen. Have we seen the worst possible examples of how that can be expressed in an unhealthy way and creating big impact, both socially and environmentally? Yes, we have. Do we throw the baby out with the bathwater? No. How do we integrate the healthy aspect and start building with that, having purpose based organizations that, can be for profit and for purpose, not necessarily one or the other. So things like that. And how do we bring the people, the values, the vision of a world in which we want to live together, in which we do work and heal, in which we can heal all the stuff that's been created by the unhealthy expressions of all the things that we don't want anymore. But how do we heal that and integrate the healthy aspects? And how do we bring these values and this purpose and environmental values and people values and social justice values at the table, while not excluding and rejecting everything else, but actually creating this as an and structure with a sense of trust and a sense of safety. And there you have something that might be calling us to create or to co-create. And that is a big, big, big leap forward for humanity if we manage to step into that.
Right.
And we look at it now, let's talk about humanity, but it's the big one for business, it's the big one for therapists, it's the big one for people.
Right.
And that job is for us to do, for us people, for us individual. How do I reconcile? How do I go back to the conclusions I've made, the traumas I've had, and with all these different sort of paradigms, and how do I find a way to create a world of and rather than a world of or?
Right. Well, and I want to come back to a conversation that my co-host Anne and I had around how this impacts then the individual. Because let's just use the pandemic, for example, right? Because if we offer, integrated solutions for the pandemic, people are still going to die. And on an individual level, that is tragic and it's sad and it's unfortunate. And I guess I'm sort of sitting with the reality of, even when we create integrative solutions, that doesn't mean everybody is going to be safe and everybody's going to be fine. And I'm sitting with the weight of that, while also I'm thinking of movies where I can't think of a particular one, but I know that I've seen this archetypal scene before where somebody recognizes that in order for the thing to move forward, they have to get left behind. And they make that choice because they understand that it's for the greater good. And I don't know what that looks like on a regular day-to-day basis. But I guess when I think about US politics right now, it feels like a lot of who is in power are the boomers. And it looks like the boomers are like, I am not ready to be put out to pasture because of the paradigms that either say you have worth or you're worth less. So they don't want to give up their power because then they'll be worth less, right? Worthless. Sorry, I'm saying it kind of weird. When you're looking at it from our perspective, it's actually you're worth more, right? On some levels, because you are willing to step aside. I think that's what Biden did. I think Biden really centered, because I was saying I thought he was really selfish for continuing to run. And when he stepped down, I said that's helping everybody move forward. And I guess, I don't know, because when it comes to like people dying or people getting harmed, I wish that there was a solution that kept everybody safe and alive and healthy in all situations, but that's just not how human bodies work.
Look, I think you're bringing an ideal in this, and there's nothing wrong with an ideal as long as we recognize it's an ideal. So, we could probably all agree that ideally nobody should suffer.
Yeah.
Nobody should be left behind. Nobody should even have to step down from anything, right? I mean,
right.
No, stay where you are. Keep contributing. You're doing great, right? I mean,
right.
Like, wouldn't we all want to hear that? So ideally, that would be great. So we wouldn't even want to create situations where people had to step down and all of that. But that would require that there's movement, that we as a society are taking notice of the situation that we're in and acting accordingly, rather than acting according to our unique worldview and principles that are never going to move.
Yeah.
And the principles, again, each of these value system has its principles, right? I mean, whether you look at the religious principles, or you look at the capitalistic principles, or you look at the people with values principles now that bring these ideals in, They all have principles. And as long as we stick to our principles and are not moving and adapting to a world that is moving, then something's going to have to break.
Right.
And what's going to have to break is the piece that's not moving.
Right.
With it. The piece that's resisting the change, that's going to have to break. But look, it's the same. Like now we're talking in the society, but it's the same at the individual level. When something new is called to come out of me because I am running out of options to deal with a certain relationship, situation in life, professional career, I am stuck. I am at the end. I feel like I've hit rock bottom. That means the life conditions around me have moved, and I have stayed with my principles and with my worldview that I wanted this way. I am right, and I deserve this, and I this, and I that. But guess what? Life didn't exactly turn out like that. And things kind of turn out differently. And the tension builds and builds and builds and builds and builds. So I'm not moving.
Yeah.
So the moments where transformation happens, it's not so much what's the new thing that comes. It's like, let go of the old. The biggest difficulty is letting go of the principles, letting go of the old. Something has to die. Something has to break in me. Every time I went through a personal transformation myself, something in me had to break, had to die. And then there was like, okay, now what? But that's the beginning of, oh, now something new can emerge. Now there's space. Now there's spaciousness. All of a sudden, like, I look at the world a bit differently, and I wonder, maybe this, maybe that, and I still don't know what it looks like. It's not like I have a plan and a map to get there. It's like it shows up and it does it on itself, right? I have nothing to do, but that sense of like, yeah, now movement's happening. Something can happen. Okay, forget that old thing. That was silly anyways. Like we're very quick to put it behind. Once we get past it, once it breaks, we are all capable of doing that. The question is, how much pressure do we need as individuals to start letting that go? And that's a muscle. That's something we can grow and develop. And, as a society, it's the same question. What part of our society that we have created, we all collective as a being, as a big being, we have created this world as it is now with the challenges we have, with everything that went wrong in it. We've created that. We're all accountable for it. So there's no, I knew it better. If you only listened to me, it wouldn't have never happened like that. We have to get out of this because that's like still I'm right, everybody else is wrong. But I think the beginning of healing anything is to just take accountability for it. Like if we as a people, if we as a country, if we as an organization, if we as a collective therapist took accountability for what we've created, which is exactly where we are now and stuck, okay, that's on us. Like what mindset led us to that? And what do we need to cut? What needs to die? So it's like we let go of something. We decide to break or kill something, metaphorically, so that something new can emerge and arrive.
And we've already hit an hour of recording, so I want to make sure that we can wrap this shortly. But I guess what I'm taking away from this and also share as an invitation to therapists is I think it's really for us as therapists who hold the ideal of caring and equanimity and all of this sort of stuff for clients, for ourselves. It's really, really easy to think of that as the right way and everything else as the wrong way. What I'm hearing from people that I really trust, who I feel are moving us towards the future, people like Adrienne Mary Brown. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, Marc, but she is somebody who I think is going beyond this idea. I think that there's freedom, and then I think that there's liberation. And I think what we really want is liberation, but we're speaking from a place that is rigid and thinks that it's right. And so it's not willing to let go of what we think is right in order to move towards liberation. And so I want you, if you're listening to this, to ask yourself that question of, is it possible? Is it possible to evolve beyond where I am in my worldview and not reject what it is that I think is right now. But yes, and some of these other things that maybe I have rejected before. And what would it look like to integrate some of this together towards a more liberated future for everyone?
Yeah. One last thing that comes to mind every time that I've gone through some healing, some transformation, there's a part of me that knew. I already knew
Yeah.
something had to move. Like that tension was there. I knew it long time ago. And and I wanted the result
Yeah.
of what was going to be on the other end,
Yes.
but I didn't want to do the work
Yeah.
to get there. I've always been resisting doing the work that is needed because of how uncomfortable it is.
Now.
Yeah, I always resisted that every step of the way. And, I guess I'm fortunate enough to have had like life conditions that pushed me over where sometimes there was no choice.
Right.
Or I felt threatened to the degree that it wasn't so much of like, oh, no, I don't want to do that. Like there was not much more thinking involved. It just had to happen. Things had to shift. I had to take the most uncomfortable thing and let it go and start looking freshly. And so, I get it. Like this desire, we need to somehow evolve. I somehow need to rethink this, knowing there's something deep inside, like this intuition is already there. And I'm pretty sure that every human being, I'm not even going to limit it to therapists, every human being listening to this episode, if you tune in with yourself,
Beyond the
what's
fear.
possible? Yeah, just like look into the field. If in my wildest dream of who I could become, in my wildest dream of who our community, our field, our country, our organization could become, in my wildest dream of who we as a civilization, as a species, what we could all become, if only we all got our asses in gear, we all know what that looks like, and that is divine.
Right. I guess to simplify it for myself, and you and I had this conversation before, that I keep focusing on the future, but I have spent a fuck ton of time in the past and dealing with all of my trauma. And so if we look at it not as how do we look towards the future, but how do we bring through the past, right? Because also as nations, when we're forgetting the past, we're not able to build a righteous future. So we got to look backwards first to go forward together.
Yeah, that's a fine line, huh? Isn't it?
Right.
Because if you only look forward, you're not going to never get anywhere because you have never solved your traumas of the past, and that they're going to come and bite you later.
Right.
And if you look only backwards, you're never going to get forward. You're only get complete with your past, and
Right.
and so maybe neither of them is right in any way.
Yeah.
Both are needed. Like some vision of where we want to go, some sort of like beacon, purpose, some North Star, future, creating, like following something, trusting something is useful, and doing a lot of the work with who I am now. What am I carrying? See, it isn't so much the past that we need to revisit, in my opinion. It's what of the past am I still carrying now that's limiting myself now? So if you look at it, the past is just what we're working with in the present. So we're actually not working really with the past. We're really always working in the present.
And you guys, that's NARM. That's NARM. We've talked about this shit over and over again. It's how am I relating to myself based on what happened in the past.
And the future is also a story we create in the present. It doesn't actually exist. Neither of them actually exist, nor the past nor the future. They're concepts that our very complex mind has learned to grapple with in a way that we can create more and more complex lives for ourselves. And it's a beautiful thing. But all that really exists is who am I now? Who am I in my body, in my being? What's alive for me now? And of course, that's conditioned by our past experience.
Right.
And we're projecting that into the future. And that gives us the pessimistic worldview that, or collapsing theory and all of that. Because if we look at the past and we just throw it forward, it's not going to look much different. So therefore, it's all going to be bad. But that's all something we're creating now.
Right. Well,
what do we want to create now?
And speaking of that, the whole reason that you are here is because you and I are going to be offering a course to sort of support therapists in being with this type of material. And I think for me, the importance is embodying and not just knowing, but really embodying what it means to understand how to work with these value systems within ourselves and see them in other people, and hopefully move towards a collective bright future. So stay tuned for details for that course. But in the meantime, Marc, where can people find you if they want to reach out?
Okay, well, I'm in Switzerland. And so the company that I've co-created is called Paradigm 21. Our website is paradigm21.ch/en if you would like the English version rather than the French version of the website. That would be a good beginning. There I have my own offerings of courses on spiral dynamics, which is the model underlying when we talk about value systems or paradigms, and some people have colors for it and all of that. That's the underlying model that I use for system change, for organizations, for working with people, with leadership, creating situational leadership. So I have some level 1 and level 2 trainings, activities that one can find there. They're all online and remote. But if you're a therapist, don't bother looking me up. Stay with Sarah and wait for the offering that we're about to put out, which is going to be really exciting. I'm really excited to start with this course with you, Sarah, combining the power of this model of spiral dynamics with creating a future in the therapy field.
Yeah. It's going to be rad, folks. The only way we're going to get through this is together. So that's what we're trying to do, is create more opportunities for embodying emergence. I don't even know, but whatever. Just join us. Just hang out with us. It'll be great. Well, thank you, Marc, so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I look forward to all of the amazingness that you and I will co-create with whoever joins us.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for having me.
Thanks to our guest for an amazing conversation today. To find out more about today's guest, you can visit www.headheartbiztherapy.com/podcast.
You can find Sarah at Head Heart Biz Therapy on Facebook and Instagram.
And you can find Anne at Spare Room Wellness or spareroomwellness.com.
Thanks as always to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for editing, to Liam O'Donnell for the album art, and to Ben Mueller for our theme music. Until next time, bye-bye.